Today we will study and reflect on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Douglas Blackmon, Slavery by Another Name, with the subtitle, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. This book documents both on an individual level and historically how the black convict labor system worked in the Deep South. When searching for photographs, we ran across a really horrifying picture of convict labor from 1903. Of young black children, many of whom may be as young as 6 years old, working in the fields in prison stripes. The photo is titled, Orphaned and Criminal Children, and the backstory behind this picture must be horrifying. Were their parents thrown into prison for vagrancy or being uppity? Or were some of their parents lynched? Who knows? Some of these youngsters probably are buried in unmarked graves at the edge of some lonely field. These convict labor camps were every bit as brutal as the Siberian Gulag labor camps in Russia under Stalin. In both systems, many of the prisoners died from overwork, neglect, abuse, and starvation. To give you a preview, a major event in the history of convict labor was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, leading the United States to formally declare war and enter World War II. Well, you'll have to listen to the video to find out why. And we always like to select quotes directly from our author. At the end of our talk, we will discuss our sources for this video. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. The 13th Amendment contained a fatal loophole that caused much suffering and death. And the text of the 13th Amendment is this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place subject to their jurisdiction. To take advantage of this loophole, the former Confederate states passed harsh vagrancy laws that criminalized loafing, which meant that any black person who was picked up by the law in a southern town was thrown in jail so he could be leased out to plantation owners under the overseer's whip, just like it was under slavery. Or they were leased out to other businesses such as factories, railroads, brick kilns, and mines. Convict leasing was brutal. Sometimes convict laborers died on the job. These convict laborers were often treated worse than slaves had been treated. Slaves had been valuable property before the war, and they were worth as much then as economy cars are worth now. But after the Civil War, the life of a black man literally had no value. Now, saying that after the Civil War, the life of a black man had no value does sound rather harsh and degrading. But this comment has been made by many scholars, including the former Yale professor in his YouTube videos of his undergraduate classes on black history. And he confirms that this comment is as harsh as it is true. And the link between democracy and justice is first seen in the history of ancient Greece. When you study the history of the radical democracy in ancient Athens, what is clear is that democracy and trials by jury and a fair judicial system develop together, hand in glove. When the government is not fair and equitable, neither is the judicial system fair and equitable. Likewise, a black man had been disenfranchised in the former Confederate states by 1901. And also by this time that judicial system of these states denied due process to all black citizens in violation of the spirit of the 14th Amendment, although the Supreme Court interpreted it so narrowly that for practical purposes it no longer applied to black citizens, but only protected corporations, which really did not need protection. In his book, Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois observes this: if a white man is assaulted by a white man or a Negro, the police are at hand. If a Negro is assaulted by a white man, the police are more apt to arrest the victim than the aggressor. Blackman cites a case where many former slaves filed suit in 1868 seeking payment for the prior year's wages. The whites responded by burning down the courthouse along with the paperwork for 1,800 lawsuits for these cases. And Du Bois also in his book Black Reconstruction quotes this account: in some states where convict labor is sold to the highest bidder, the cruel treatment is beyond description. Prison inspectors find convicts herded together irrespective of age, confined at night in shackles, sometimes packed like sardines in old boxcars. During the day they worked under armed guards who stand ready to shoot down any who may attempt to escape from this hell on earth. Should one escape, the bloodhounds track them down, and when they are brought back, they are severely flogged and put in double shackles, or worse. Blackman says this about convict labor. The quasi-slavery of the 20th century was rooted in the nascent industrial slavery that flourished in the last years of the Civil War. The same men who built railroads with thousands of slaves and proselytized for the use of slaves in southern factories and mines in the 1850s were the first to employ forced African labor in the 1870s. Most southern states enacted vagrancy laws by 1865 that were so vaguely worded that any blacks could be arrested if they were on the streets and not working. Some states enacted laws making it illegal for black workers to change employers without permission. The convict labor system was strongest in the Black Belt. That was the rich cotton farmland stretching from South Carolina through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. As Blackman states, here the moral rationalization of slavery and the view of slaves as the essential proof of white men's royal status became as fundamental to the whites' perception of America as the concept of liberty itself. A century later, this was the paradox of the post-Civil War South. Recognition of freed slaves as full humans appeared to most white Southerners not as an extension of liberty, but as a violation of their liberty, and as a challenge to the legitimacy of their definition of what it was to be white. Working conditions were brutal for convict laborers. The companies working them had no supervision. They could chain them, whip them, or even shoot them when they tried to escape. In the worst cases, they were starved and brutalized. In the first 2 years convicts were leased in Alabama, 1 in 5 died. But by the 4th year, nearly half of the convict laborers died in Alabama. State inspectors said this about private prisons for convict workers in Birmingham, Alabama. They were totally unfit for use, without ventilation, without adequate water supplies, crowded to excess, filthy beyond description. Prisoners were poorly clothed and fed, cruelly punished. There were no hospitals. The sick were neglected. They were so intimidated that they dared not say anything about their maltreatment. Some changes were made under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the bully president. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president when William McKinley was assassinated in September 1901. Earlier that year, he had accepted an invitation to speak at the black leader of Booker T. Washington's school, the Tuskegee Institute. And later, Washington recommended a moderate for an important U.S. District Court judge. Roosevelt invited the black educator to a private dinner in the White House, but was shocked at the outrage in the South for his inviting a colored man to dine with his wife and children. Oh my God. Senator Tillman of South Carolina ranted, "Now that Roosevelt has eaten with that nigger Washington, we shall have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back to their places." And the governor of Georgia said, "No Southerner can respect any white man who would eat with a Negro." But then, in May of 1903, under the Roosevelt administration, something else unthinkable happened. A federal Secret Service detective was interviewing blacks about labor practices related to convict labor. They had no idea. Federal authorities discovered multiple slavery rings in Alabama. In Lowndes County, they estimated that there were thousands of convict laborers hired by dozens of local landowners. U.S. Attorney Reese said this about the widespread practice. Peonage is crueler and more inhuman than the slavery of the antebellum days. Since back then the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons, just as he wanted to keep his horse and mule healthy. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a peon costs but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several $100s. 40 years after Lincoln emancipated the slaves, the first men in Alabama were indicted by a grand jury for illegally holding slaves. The defendants insisted they were merely the friends of the blacks, that everything they did was legal, except that they had to admit that sometimes the paperwork was missing. There were frequent and flagrant attempts to intimidate and tamper with the dirt-poor black witnesses. The grand jury in Montgomery, Alabama, returned 63 indictments. In addition, the Attorney General Knox detected dozens of other cases of peonage across Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. The national press was covering these proceedings, causing shock and embarrassment over these cruelties, which slowly helped change public opinion, very, very slowly. Coaxing a grand jury to indict was far less problematic than persuading a white jury to convict fellow whites for peonage. Some defendants who pled guilty were, to their surprise, sentenced to serve short prison sentences. But for at least one case covered by Blackman, there were likely more. The white jury refused to convict their fellow white man for peonage, even when the evidence was overwhelming. This meant that many of the guilty were set free after pleading guilty after agreeing to pay a small fine. The lynchings, the violence, the peonage continued. One black minister even complained that his young daughter had been kidnapped and local authorities would not help with her return. In Louisiana, a federal marshal investigating convict labor cases was forced to flee for his life. This Roosevelt administration just threw up their hands. This was not a problem they could solve in the face of such widespread resistance, as Southern juries could never be relied on to convict. And the brutality of peonage continues. And the brutality continued through the 1930s. In 1912, the racist segregationist Southern Woodrow Wilson was elected president, assuring the federal government would not pursue civil rights cases. Lynchings continued, blacks were denied the vote and due process, and after the black veterans returned from fighting in World War I, insisting on civil rights, knowing how to bear arms, race riots erupted in many American cities, burning down black homes and businesses with no compensation and no justice. And this picture shows a movable work camp from 1910. The inmates were quartered in wagons equipped with bunks and moved from place to place. And the dogs are bloodhounds used to run down anyone who attempted to escape. Even in ancient times, when slavery was more benign, there were two truths in any system of slavery. First, women slaves were quite often sexually assaulted, and since they were property, this was not a crime. And second, the worst type of slave was a slave who worked in the mines deep below the earth. In the Deep South, white men could always take advantage of black girls. Blackman tells us how black girls were abused when they inquired about their incarcerated relatives or husbands. It was common practice in many prisons for girls to come around to the jailer's room for an hour of sex in exchange for a favor to their man inside. Worse, at the lumber camps in southern Alabama, women seeking the freedom of their men were simply arrested when they arrived, chained into their cells, and kept to sexually service the men running the camps. The slave camps and mines produced scores of babies, nearly all of them with white fathers. Soon after emancipation, Booker T. Washington worked in the coal mines as a young man before he was able to go to school. Now, he was not a convict laborer, so he was able to quit as soon as he could. Booker remembers working in the coal mine. The work was not only hard, but it was also dangerous. There was always the danger of being blown to pieces by a premature explosion of powder, or by being crushed by falling slate. Accidents were frequent, as we were in constant fear. Many small children worked in the coal mines, with no hope of gaining an education. Young boys who began life in a coal mine are often physically and mentally dwarfed. They soon lose ambition to do anything else than to continue as a coal miner. Blackman chronicles the brutal conditions of the Pratt slave mines in Alabama. Inside the mine shafts, deadly gases accumulated in unventilated sections. Work continued even as water, seeping from the walls and fouled with the miners' waste and excrement, accumulated in the shafts. Intestinal disorders, malaria, pneumonia, and respiratory problems dogged the men. Endless contact with coal dust led to black lung disease, a miserable and certain slow death. He continues, hardly a week passed that accidents didn't take men's fingers, hands, toes, or worse. Often the cause was a careless swing of a pick, but almost as frequently men were crushed by coal falling before they expected, or pinned by railroad cars that derailed. Sometimes miners died by touching a live wire, and horribly, often younger boys were molested by the older men. In 1908, the Georgia legislature established a commission to examine the state's convict leasing system. They found over 3,000 blacks lived in forced labor camps, and that over 600 black convict laborers had been resold to other camps. In one camp, inmates with tuberculosis were left to die in a shed. Blackman notes that witnesses told the commission that the prisoners working in a brickyard kiln were fed rotting and rancid food, housed in barracks rife with insects, driven by whips into the hottest and most intolerable areas of the plant, and continually required to work at a constant run in the heat of the ovens. The plant was so hot that the guards didn't carry guns for fear their cartridges would explode. And there was much worse testimony. The next year, with newspaper headlines blaring, the convict leasing system was abolished in Georgia. Several other states abolished convict leasing, but some others soon reestablished it. And then in place of leasing came another reform, the chain gang. As an aside, all-white chain gangs, like in Cool Hand Luke, were unlikely, although sometimes poor whites were swept up in this injustice. But there was freedom at last from peonage. America would experience an event that would lead finally to the federal government ending the practice of convict labor in America. That was a day that would live in infamy, December 12, 1941, when the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. FDR knew that the fascists' enemies of America would exploit any news that blacks were being exploited in our country. It was only 5 days after the attack that Attorney General Biddle issued a directive to all federal prosecutors that they should no longer ignore cases of involuntary servitude or convict labor. In a wartime speech, Biddle proclaimed, "One response this country has had to the challenge of the ideals of democracy made by the new ideologies of fascism and communism has been a deepened realization that the values of our government must be based on a belief in the dignity and rights of man." These convict labor cases would now be vigorously prosecuted. Blackman writes, as the war progressed, the Department of Justice vigorously prosecuted U.S. Sugar Company in Florida for forcing black men into their sugarcane fields. Sheriffs who colluded with the company were brought to trial. Blackman does not describe widespread resistance to this policy, although we know there was broad resistance. He only describes a small number of prosecutions because times had changed. Now, black soldiers who returned home after this World War refused to be docile, sometimes moving north for better opportunities, and they would later participate in the civil rights movement that swept the country. And as Martin Luther King later said, there comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Our main source is Slavery by Another Name, a Pulitzer Prize winning book written by Douglas Blackman. He has a mix of history and personal stories. And this book is highly recommended by the Reconstruction scholar Eric Foner of Columbia University. Sometimes the incredible brutality of the Jim Crow segregation system is lost in general histories, and this brutality sometimes can be much more evident in narrow histories such as this on convict labor. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.